A family at a remote farmhouse is attacked by Wolfman, but as the night stretches on, the father begins to transform into a wolf. The film begins with Blake, a young boy, living with his father Grady in a jungle. They embark on a hunt. Just then, Grady and Blake spot a deer and both take aim, but miss the shot. When Grady turns around, Blake is nowhere to be seen as Blake is searching for the deer in the jungle with gun in hand. When he looks through the gun's scope, he sees someone standing, but when he looks again, there's no one. Blake heads back, and suddenly, Grady appears, grabbing Blake's jacket and scolding him angrily for wandering off alone. Grady scolds him for putting himself in danger. As a father, Grady is furious because he doesn't want his son to become the hunted while hunting. They hear a wolf's howl, but don't see it. It starts raining. Grady tells Blake to go to the treehouse and stays behind to investigate. In the treehouse, Grady tells Blake to cover his ears and he points his gun at the door, sensing someone is approaching. Someone comes close to the door, but a loud, deafening sound occurs, followed by an eerie silence. Grady cautiously investigates and finds a wounded wolf lying on the grass, covered in blood. Then, through his gun's scope, he sees someone running behind the trees, so he quickly fires his gun. At night, Blake sneaks into the basement, finding his father, Grady Lovell, who has a tattoo on his arm, using the radio. Startled, Blake quickly runs back upstairs. 30 years later, Blake is shown to be a loving father to his daughter, Ginger. After a brief encounter with a strange man, Blake apologizes to Ginger for overreacting, and she senses his love and concern. At home, Blake and Ginger share a heartwarming moment. Charlotte arrives and hands Blake a file about his father, Grady Lovell, but silences him before he can ask questions. The next day, Blake waits for Charlotte outside her office, and they discuss their concerns about Ginger's attachment to him. They decide to take a trip to Blake's family home in Oregon. As they travel through Oregon in their Pierce, the family's strong bond is evident. However, when they arrive at their destination, Blake becomes unsure of the route and stops the car in a jungle. With no phone signal, they're unable to access a map. Ginger spots a treehouse with someone standing in it and points it out to her parents. Blake calls out to the man, Derek, who approaches them with a gun, making Charlotte fearful. Despite this, Blake recognizes Derek and asks for directions to his father's house. Derek offers to guide them, and Blake allows him to join, despite Charlotte's reservations. As night falls, Blake suddenly sees a wild man standing in front of the car. He swerves to avoid hitting him, and the car rolls over into a ditch. Regaining consciousness, Blake finds the car upside down. Charlotte and Ginger are trapped and panicked in the back seat. Blake tries to stop Derek from escaping, but he flees through the open car door. Charlotte and Ginger manage to escape through the shattered windshield and climb onto the car's roof. Blake spots the beast-like man in the side mirror and summons the courage to close the car door. The beast attacks the windshield, shattering it and injuring Blake's arm. Then it drags Derek away, leaving the family in a desperate fight for survival. Derek's foolish decision to exit the car proved fatal, making him the beast's victim. The scene is intense and terrifying. After the beast departs, Blake escapes the car and helps Charlotte and Ginger jump out, catching them safely. They sprint towards Blake's childhood home, driven by fear. As a wolf's haunting howl echoes through the air, they frantically rush inside, and Blake locks the door, barricading it against the beast's fierce pounding. Eventually, the beast relents and leaves. As the silence returns, Blake cautiously checks the windows, ensuring the beast is no longer nearby. He grabs a flashlight and begins to inspect the house. Meanwhile, Charlotte sits frozen on the sofa, clinging to Ginger, both still paralyzed with fear. Blake ventures to the basement where he locates the circuit breaker and power supplier. He activates the circuit, and the outside generator roars to life, gradually illuminating the house. As Blake returns upstairs, Ginger rushes to hug him tightly. He gently lays her down on the sofa, but she wakes up again, clinging to him desperately. It's clear that she's traumatized by the horrific events she witnessed. Blake reassures Ginger and leaves the room to barricade a door, using a heavy almirah to block it. Then he heads to the basement with Charlotte, attempting to contact someone via radio. However, their efforts are futile, and Charlotte's frustration grows. Blake notices a smell and enters the storeroom in the basement, where he finds meat hanging. He picks up something nearby and starts eating, but it's too hard and his tooth breaks, causing his mouth to bleed. Charlotte quickly hands Blake some tissues to stop the bleeding. She then notices the cut on Blake's arm and immediately applies a bandage. Blake reinforces the door, adding extra security measures. The noise draws Ginger and Charlotte's attention, and they come to investigate. Charlotte then gently lays Ginger down on the sofa, hugging her tightly to comfort her. Despite his injuries, Blake persists in securing the door, hammering nails into it to make it stronger. In his exhausted state, he accidentally strikes his own hand with an axe. Blake's selfless efforts to protect his family continue throughout the night. Blake senses something amiss and quietly goes upstairs to investigate a closet, where he discovers a spider that makes him feel lightheaded. Returning to his wife and daughter, Charlotte notices Blake's distress and sees him signal for silence. Then they catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure passing outside the house. Blake gets up to investigate through the window and sees a strange creature surrounding outside the house. As he tries to listen for any sounds at the door, the beast breaks through the bottom of the door and grabs Blake's leg, pulling him. Charlotte quickly grabs an axe and strikes the beast's hand, causing it to retreat. The parents' screams alert Ginger, who rushes to the scene, terrified and crying for her father. Blake manages to pull himself back and sits down, but he's clearly in immense pain. Blake awakens on the sofa, noticing the time is 1:40. He gets up to find Charlotte in the basement, tearfully trying to contact a radio station, but her efforts are in vain. She's extremely worried about Blake's condition, as he's been infected and is severely ill. Charlotte desperately wants Blake to receive medical attention as soon as possible. Blake tries to speak, but is unable to. Charlotte gets up and walks over to Blake, who is behind her. She sees that Blake's legs are bleeding profusely onto the floor. She lays Blake down on the bed in front of Ginger, who is lying on the sofa and looking at her sick father. Blake is extremely ill, with strange marks appearing on his face. When he runs his hand through his hair, it falls out and clings to his hands. Charlotte hands Blake a pen and copy so he can write what he wants to say. With great difficulty, Blake writes, "Dying," on the paper. Very sad. Charlotte tries to comfort Blake. She tells him how important he is to her and how much she loves him. But Blake's vision is fading to black. He cannot understand what Charlotte is saying. He tells her, "What's happening? I don't understand you." Ginger sadly walks over to her parents. Her mother tries to reassure her that Blake will be okay. As Blake tries to sit up, Charlotte sees that his arm is still bleeding. When she folds up his shirt sleeve, she sees that his arm is severely damaged. Even his bones are exposed. Blake's arm is covered in blood, and he rushes far from his wife to the corner of the room and starts scratching brutally his wounds. Charlotte is horrified. But then Blake's behavior becomes even more horrible when he starts to eat his own wounded arm like a wild animal with savage noises. His mouth is covered in blood. Charlotte is shocked and frightened. She stands frozen in place. Then Blake stops in front of her. Charlotte retrieves the keys from the basement, which she found earlier, and grabs a knife. She gets her family out of the house into the old car. Then she tries to start the car by plugging the battery with the engine of the vehicle. When the car starts, she unplugged the battery cables and gets back in the car to wipe the front windshield, and she sees the humanoid wolf standing in front of the car. Charlotte screams, and the wolf man breaks the windshield, reaching inside the car. Charlotte hits its hand with a knife, and Ginger opens the car door to run out. Everyone runs and climbs onto the roof of the tent house. The wolf chases after them. Blake pulls the ladder up to prevent the wolf man from climbing up. Their weight causes the roof locks to start to open. The wolf man tries to break into the attic to get Blake and his family. The wolfman's ferocity terrifies everyone and then tears through the attic roof with his claws. Ginger starts to crawl towards her parents as she falls through the torn roof screaming. The wolfman tries to grab her, but her parents pull her up to safety. Then Blake signals to Charlotte to take Ginger back to the house. Then he jumps from the attic and runs towards the jungle with the wolfman chasing him. To save his family, Blake sacrifices himself to become the wolfman's victim. Charlotte takes Ginger and runs back to the house. Inside the house, Ginger gets angry with her mother for leaving her father behind, especially since he is sick and needs them. The poor girl is extremely distressed because she loves her father very much and cannot bear what is happening. Her mother explains to her that Blake is doing this to protect Ginger. After a while, Blake returns home and Charlotte opens the door. He enters and walks away, sitting on the floor. His face and teeth are severely disfigured, and his hair has fallen out. Ginger approaches her father and tries to touch his forehead, but Blake makes a sound to stop her. However, Ginger still places her hand on her father's forehead and tries to tell him what he's thinking. But Blake can't understand Ginger, and everything appears bluish to him. Even his dear daughter, who's constantly showing her love and devotion to him. Blake leans forward, growling, and Ginger starts to back away slowly. Blake's nails fall out and he vomits blood, expelling the same thing he had eaten earlier from the basement storage. Ginger screams as she sees her father's condition, and her mother picks her up and takes her away. Blake picks up the thing he vomited and looks at it, with blood and saliva dripping from his mouth. Then Blake gets up and walks toward Charlotte, breathing heavily in a menacing manner, standing right in front of her. While Ginger is sitting on the floor, watches this scene helplessly and cries. However, Charlotte still stands and is not backing away from Blake. Then, without harming Charlotte, Blake moves away from her. As soon as Blake opens the front door, the terrifying wolf man attacks him, throwing him to the ground and pouncing on him, biting his neck and killing him brutally. The wolf man, growling, picks up Blake and continues to attack him. Blake tries to defend himself but is overpowered. Charlotte comes from behind and hits the wolf man with a knife, but the wolf man drops Blake and turns towards Charlotte. The wolf man chases Charlotte and Ginger, who are screaming and running away. Charlotte locks Ginger in a room and stands in front of the wolf man. Just as the wolf man, with its severed fingers bleeding, is about to attack Charlotte, Blake intervenes. Charlotte escapes, and the wolf man slams Blake into the wall, causing cracks on the wall. Blake defends himself, trying to choke the wolf man, but the wolf man throws Blake again, and Blake runs away, attacking the wolf man from behind, whereas Charlotte returns with an iron stick and hits the wolf man. Ginger's screams from the room distract the wolf man, and Charlotte hits it again. The wolf man approaches Charlotte, who strikes it once more, while Blake gets up to attack the wolf man and knocks it down, biting its neck to vanquish the monstrous creature. Blake gets up and spits on the wolf man's corpse. Then he notices a tattoo on its arm that reads, Lovell. This revelation confirms that the wolf man was actually Blake's father, Grady Lovell, who had transformed. Blake looks at his father's corpse with regret, while Charlotte watches the scene in shock. Covered in blood, Blake runs out of the house. Blake, writhing in pain, tries to lie down on the grass, but his body begins to contort and mutate. His hands transform into animal-like claws, his bones become visible, and his face becomes even more disfigured. His nails fall out, and sharp spikes emerge. After enduring this agonizing transformation, Blake becomes a complete wolf man. His senses become heightened, and he can see the jungle clearly even in the dark of night, and he lets out a loud wolf-like howl. In the house, Charlotte sits next to Grady's dead body and tells Ginger that he is Blake's father, who went missing in the jungle many years ago and never returned. As he became a wolf man, nobody could recognize him. Suddenly, the house lights go out. When Charlotte gets up and looks out the window, she sees Blake standing outside, who has fully transformed into a wolf man. Charlotte is frightened and moves back, picking up a knife from the floor. She looks around and sees Blake is behind Ginger. Ginger screams and runs to her mother. In this horrifying situation, Charlotte screams and calls out to Blake, but he doesn't respond. Ginger is scared of her father as he tries to grab her, but Charlotte slashes his hand to protect Ginger. Blake tries to pull the knife from Charlotte's hand, but it gets injured even more. Then Charlotte takes Ginger out of the house and hides in a nearby garage. There, Charlotte finds a chain and sets a trap, then hides with Ginger. After a while, Blake arrives, and despite the darkness, he can see everything clearly. However, his wife and daughter appear distorted to him. As he moves forward, his foot gets caught in the trap. Charlotte shines a torch on him, and then she and Ginger scream and run out of the garage. Blake tries to chase them, but is unable to escape the trap. But Blake frees himself from the trap by gnawing off his own leg like an animal and escapes the garage. It's weird how brutally he cut off his feet from his leg. On the other hand, Charlotte and Ginger flee into the jungle in fear, with Blake growling and chasing after them. As they run, they arrive at the point where their car accident happened. Here they also find Derek's scattered body parts. Charlotte searches around and finds Derek's gun. Seeing Blake approaching from the crashed car, Charlotte takes Ginger and hides in the treehouse. Blake, with his severed and injured leg, quickly rushes towards them. Charlotte and Ginger are hiding and sensing Blake's presence getting closer. Blake reaches the treehouse door, and Charlotte points the gun at him. When Blake sees his daughter, Ginger senses her father's feelings and tells her mother that, "Mummy, he wants this to be over." Hearing this, Blake looks at Charlotte and breaks the door of treehouse, but without any delay, Charlotte shoots him with the gun, causing him falls to the ground. Charlotte and Ginger both start crying inside the treehouse. This is a heart-wrenching situation. A loving wife killing her beloved husband with her own hands, and a daughter witnessing her father's suffering and death. After this, Charlotte and Ginger approach Blake, who is lying on the ground. Ginger is crying and puts her hand on her father's forehead. Then, Blake looks at the sky and takes his last breath. Ginger hugs her mother, crying. This is an extremely sad scenario. Blake's one wrong decision to visit his ancestral home destroyed his entire life and happy family. Finally, Charlotte takes Ginger and leaves the place, marking the end of the film. If you like this movie, then don't forget to subscribe the channel.